My name is Alina. I turned 18 last week. Everyone told me it wouldn't feel any different, that I'd wake up the next morning and still be me. Still the same girl who spent every morning at the track, every afternoon at the gym, and every night falling asleep with sore muscles and dreams full of gold medals and finish lines. And maybe for a while it didn't feel any different. But lately, I don't know. Something's changed. Something I can't quite explain. Maybe it was the way people started looking at me after my birthday, like some invisible line had been crossed overnight. A line between girl and woman. Between who I was and who I was allowed to become. And maybe the one person I didn't expect to notice that shift was Daniel. My stepfather. He married my mom when I was 14, right when I was old enough to resent him for stepping into a place I wasn't sure anyone deserved. But he never pushed. Never acted like he was trying to replace my real dad, who had walked out on us long before I could even remember the sound of his voice. Daniel was different. Quiet. Steady. Safe. He was a massage therapist, had been for years. Owned a little studio in town. Worked with everyone from overworked moms to professional athletes. Including me. That's how it started, really. When I began competing more seriously in track and field, my body became this constant project, a machine I was always repairing, adjusting, trying to push past its limits. And Daniel, with those calm eyes and hands that always seemed to know exactly where the pain was hiding, was the one I turned to. First, it was simple. Daniel, my calves are locking up again. My back's killing me from the new workout routine. My hamstrings are like guitar strings today. He'd nod. Barely speak. Just gesture toward the massage table he kept in the little home studio off the living room. But last night felt different. I had just come back from a brutal evening run, the kind I pushed myself through just to quiet my mind. The air outside had been thick with heat, clinging to my skin like a second layer. By the time I walked through the front door, sweat soaked through my tank top and my legs felt like lead. Daniel was in the kitchen, wiping down the counter, the faint smell of peppermint oil clinging to him from his last client. He looked up when he saw me. And for a second, just a second, his eyes stayed on me a moment longer than usual. Not in a bad way. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable. But in a way that made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't name. "Long run?" he asked, his voice that deep, steady calm I'd gotten so used to over the years. I nodded, pulling my hair off my sticky neck. "Yeah, too long, probably. My back's tight." Without even thinking about it, without realizing how natural it had become, I added, "Could you help me?" He didn't hesitate. "Go set up." I headed to the studio, stripping off my running shoes, tossing my damp hair into a messy bun, and lay down on the table face down like I'd done 100 times before. And yet this time felt different. Maybe because I was different. Maybe because I wasn't 17 anymore. Maybe because I'd caught myself noticing things about him lately, the way his hands moved with this quiet precision, the way he never rushed, never made me feel small or silly for needing help. When his hands met my skin, I inhaled sharply. Not because it hurt, but because I had forgotten how good it felt to be seen. Truly seen. He worked in silence, pressing into the muscles along my lower back, the long sweep of his thumbs up my spine, the warm press of his palms against the knots that always seemed to find their way into my shoulders. "You're tense," he murmured. "Always," I whispered back, barely able to keep my voice steady. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell anymore. My body melted under his touch, every wall I built during the day slowly crumbling beneath his hands. And then, his voice again. Soft. Careful. "Alina, are you okay?" I swallowed. Lying there, stretched out on the table, every part of me feeling too raw, too real, I didn't know what to say. I could lie. I could say I was fine. But I wasn't. Not really. 'Cause something had shifted between us. Something I wasn't ready to name. But I couldn't unfeel it. Couldn't unknow the way his touch stayed with me long after I left the table. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my skin still humming with the memory of him. And I realized something that made my heart race faster than any sprint I'd ever run. I didn't want to go back to the way things were. I didn't want to pretend I hadn't felt it too. Whatever it was. The days after that night stayed with me like warmth under my skin. The memory of Daniel's hands on my back, careful, respectful, but aware, didn't leave me. And maybe I didn't want it to. But a part of me wanted to know if it was just me. If I was imagining it all. Or if he felt it too. That's when the idea started growing in my head. Quiet, dangerous. I could make him notice. I could make him watch. Started small. After practice, I began leaving my tank tops on a little longer, clinging to me from the sweat of sprints and squats, knowing he'd glance up from his book when I walked through the house. And he did. Not obvious. Never inappropriate. But his eyes would catch for just a second too long. Sometimes I'd catch his jaw tighten just slightly. Thrilled me in a way I didn't understand. One evening, when I came home from the gym, I waited until he was in the kitchen making tea. Then I pulled out my phone and began texting, letting my voice sound softer, almost teasing as I giggled at the screen. I could feel him glance over. "Someone special?" he asked, too casual. I turned just enough so he could see the little smile on my lips. "Maybe," I replied, letting the word linger in the air like perfume. It worked. His back straightened. His hands stilled on the mug for a heartbeat too long. I didn't push further. Not yet. But that night at dinner, he was quieter than usual, watching me like I was someone new. And I loved it. A few days later, I took it a step further. I came home late from training, my body exhausted but buzzing with something restless. Instead of showering right away, I stayed in the living room, scrolling through my phone on the couch, stretched out just enough to look unbothered. Just enough for him to notice how long my legs looked in my tiny running shorts. He was reading again, or pretending to. But every time I shifted, adjusted my ponytail, stretched my arms over my head, I felt his eyes trace me in the reflection of the window. It wasn't wrong. It wasn't crossing a line. But it wasn't innocent anymore. It was something else. Something we both felt building like pressure in the silence between us. Then came the moment that really set everything in motion. A boy from my training group, Mark, started walking me home after practice. He was harmless, friendly. But when he offered to come in for a minute just to grab a bottle of water before heading out, I didn't say no. Daniel was in the kitchen. When I walked in with Mark, laughing at some silly joke, I didn't have to look at Daniel to feel the shift in the air. Temperature dropped. He was polite, but distant. Mark didn't stay long. He never even noticed the storm brewing in Daniel's calm silence. But I did. After the door closed, I lingered in the kitchen, pretending to look for a snack. Daniel's voice was low. New boyfriend? His tone was even. But his jaw was tight. I bit my lip, pretending to think about it. "Maybe," I whispered. Silence. Then quieter, rougher. "Don't let him touch you like you're less than you are." It hit me like a shiver. I looked up, meeting his eyes. And I saw it there. Possession. Concern. Something raw. Something careful and burning at the same time. "I won't," I replied, my voice softer than I meant. And that night, lying in bed, I realized I didn't want boys my age. I didn't want their clumsy hands and careless words. I wanted this. I wanted him to see me. Not as a girl. Not as a daughter. But as me. As a woman who belonged to no one. Unless he wanted me to. Strange how a house can feel so familiar and yet so unbearably different, like the walls themselves are holding their breath, listening to every word left unsaid, every quiet glance stretched longer than it should be, every moment charged with something too fragile to name and too dangerous to ignore. That's how it felt between Daniel and me after that evening, after Mark's harmless visit that turned out to be anything but harmless in the silence of our home. I knew exactly what I was doing. And I knew Daniel knew it too. But neither of us was willing to say it aloud. Not yet, not when the very not saying of it was the thread keeping us from unraveling completely. I could feel him watching me differently now, like I had shifted just slightly in his world, stepped out from the soft shadow of childhood into a light that caught on every line of my body, every movement that was no longer innocent, no longer thoughtless. And I leaned into it. I didn't mean to, not at first, not in the beginning when I still thought I was just playing with something shallow, something fleeting, but it stopped being a game so quickly I hardly noticed the ground beneath me give way to something deeper, something that made my heart race for reasons I didn't dare examine too closely. One night, a few days later, I came home from the gym later than usual. The summer heat still clung to my skin like a second breath, the faint salt of sweat drying along my collarbones, and I didn't even hesitate before walking into the kitchen still in my running shorts and a thin white tank that stuck slightly to the curve of my lower back. Daniel was there. Of course he was. Leaning against the counter in that quiet, still way he had, the way that made him seem like part of the room, part of the calm that wrapped around me and made me feel too seen, too known, and yet completely safe. I opened the fridge, pretending I didn't feel his eyes on me. But I did. I felt them like a touch along the curve of my neck, like a breath against my spine. "I was about to call you," he said, his voice rough around the edges, not from anger. Daniel never raised his voice, but from something heavier, something older. "Why?" I asked, glancing over my shoulder, letting my voice fall softer than it needed to. He didn't answer right away. He never rushed. "Just got late." Simple words. But they wrapped around me in a way that made me forget the boyish smiles of Mark or the teasing glances from guys at practice, because none of them ever made me feel like this. Like I mattered in a way that was silent and heavy and full of something sacred. I closed the fridge, took a long drink from the cold bottle of water, feeling his gaze catch on the movement of my throat, the way the muscles in my neck shifted, and when I lowered the bottle I saw it. The look. He didn't hide it anymore. Not completely. A slow drag of his eyes from my bare legs to my face, a look not of ownership but of knowing, of warning. And something in me broke open, not with fear, but with a sweetness so sharp it made my breath catch in my chest. I walked past him, slowly, deliberately, feeling the air shift between us like a thread tightening. And just before I left the room I turned, met his eyes fully and smiled. Not the smile of a girl. Not the safe, soft smile of a daughter, but a woman's smile. A knowing smile. And for the first time, he didn't look away. I don't know what came over me that evening. Maybe it was the quiet hum of the house, the way the light outside had grown soft and golden as the sun disappeared behind the rooftops. Maybe it was the heaviness in the air between us that had been building unspoken for weeks now, but something in me decided to do it. Something reckless. Something almost playful. I was barefoot, walking slowly down the hallway, knowing exactly where Daniel was. In the living room, leaning over the table, sorting through some papers from work, I could hear the faint sound of his breath, the rustle of paper, the stillness of his presence like gravity pulling me closer. And that's when I let myself fall. On purpose. A small, surprised gasp escaped my lips, loud enough for him to hear, sharp enough to break the calm. And the next thing I knew, he was there, moving faster than I had ever seen him move before, his hands reaching out, steady, strong, catching me just before I could hit the floor. "Alina, are you all right?" His voice was rough, deeper than usual, threaded with worry that twisted through me like warmth. I let myself stay in his arms for just a second longer than necessary, feeling the strength of him, the closeness, the way my heart thudded violently in my chest because I knew this wasn't just about falling. This was about something else. Something we weren't supposed to feel. Something neither of us could stop. His hands were on my waist, steadying me, his eyes searching mine with this fierce, silent concern that felt like it reached inside me and pulled out every breath I didn't know I was holding. "I'm fine," I whispered too softly, and I didn't move. Neither did he. And then, before I could talk myself out of it, before either of us could remember the rules we weren't supposed to break, I leaned in. Just slightly. Just enough. His breath caught. And then his lips met mine. It wasn't planned. It wasn't slow. It wasn't hesitant. It was everything built up in silence spilling over in a rush of feeling so real, so overwhelming that I felt my knees go weak again, only this time from something else entirely. His hand moved to the back of my neck, cradling me carefully, holding me like I was something fragile and precious all at once, and the kiss deepened with this aching tenderness that made my whole body forget how to be still. But then, the sound of keys, the front door opening, the unmistakable voice of my mother calling out, light and casual, not knowing, not seeing the storm she had just stepped into. Alina? Daniel? I'm home. We broke apart like the world had snapped back into place with cruel precision. His hands fell away from me. I stumbled back, heart racing, lips tingling with the ghost of what we had done, what we had almost let happen. Daniel's face was pale, but his eyes, those eyes I had learned to read too well, they weren't regretful. They were wild, alive, and afraid. 'Cause what we had started couldn't be undone. Not now. Not ever. I don't know how I stood there without shaking, without collapsing completely into the same trembling I could feel pulsing through my veins, because when my mother's voice filled the house, light, unaware, the soft, casual melody of someone returning to a life she thought was still untouched and safe, I realized with a sharpness that almost hurt that Daniel and I were no longer part of that ordinary world she was walking back into, that we had stepped beyond it, if only for a breathless second, and there was no return from that. My lips still felt warm. His scent, that faint trace of mint and cedar and skin I had never let myself notice until it was far too late, clung to me like an invisible mark, and for a heartbeat I stood there between him and the doorway like I was standing between two worlds, between the girl I had always been and the girl I could never be again. And Daniel, oh Daniel! He stood so still, so impossibly motionless, like a man trying to erase himself from his own house, from his own body, his hands clenched at his sides as if afraid of what they might do if he didn't hold them still, his eyes dark and wide in a face that had always been calm, always been patient, but was now something else entirely. Raw, vulnerable, alive in a way that tore at me with every beat of my racing heart. Alina? Are you upstairs? My mother's voice floated closer, footsteps light, bags rustling, the ordinary rhythm of home life carrying on without mercy, without pause for the fact that my world had tilted forever in a living room bathed in the quiet golden shadows of early evening. I found my voice, if you could call it that, brittle and barely above a whisper. I'm here, Mom. Daniel flinched. Not because of the words, but because of the sound of me speaking, of me pulling myself back across that impossible line, of me pretending I could still wear the face I had worn every day before tonight. I moved first, of course I did, because I was young, because I was burning, because I didn't know yet how long regret could stretch its shadow over a heart that wanted what it shouldn't. I stepped past him, and every inch between us was louder than words. I could feel him breathe out behind me like he'd been holding it all along, like the moment I passed him was both agony and relief, and it stung, oh it stung, because I knew I could never unfeel what I had felt in his arms. When I reached the kitchen, when I saw my mother unpacking groceries, smiling at me like the world was still simple and clean and whole, I wanted to scream. But I didn't. I smiled back. Like I was supposed to. Like I hadn't just crossed a line with the man who wasn't supposed to look at me like that, touch me like that, kiss me like that. And Daniel, he stayed away. But of course he did. But I could feel him. Every room in that house held him now, every wall echoed with what we had done and not done, every glance between us over the dinner table later that night was so weighted, so impossibly charged that I thought I might shatter from the quiet of it. I barely heard what my mother was saying. Something about her trip. Something about the weather. Normal things. Safe things. Things that belonged to the life we had broken. But every time my eyes met his, across the table over the faint clatter of dishes and silverware, it was there. In him. In me. That kiss. That terrible, perfect, beautiful kiss. It hung between us like a promise neither of us dared speak. But both of us knew. It would happen again. It was only a matter of time.